with the panelists who will be really contributing into the conversation. In our midst, I would like to acknowledge several people who are part of the conversation. I think the first one is Mr. Wamkele Mene, who's the Secretary General of the Africa Trade Agreement. The second one is the Ambassador Kingsley Mamabolo, who will also be contributing in the conversation. Ms. Lebogang Pheko, who's a development economist, feminist economist, and as well as political analyst. And Siya Biniza, a political economist, who will be part of the conversation. And I wish to acknowledge ANC and its members who are in our midst this afternoon, as well as the SACP Central Executive Committee, COSATU leadership, Pan-African Women's Organization, Mama Secretary General Mama Grace Kabayo, ANC Women's League, members ANC Youth League, YCL leadership present, and MDM structures. I wish to acknowledge members of the diplomatic community that are here present, an ambassador from Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, ambassadors that might not, have not confirmed earlier. I just want to acknowledge their presence. I would also like to acknowledge the South African, ambassador present from Sudan, Ataro from Ghana, ZANU-PF Youth in our midst, MPLA comrades and friends present from Tanzania, Namibia, Lesotho, Mozambique, provincial leadership of alliance structures that is in our midst participating in the conversation this afternoon to celebrate Africa Day Month. Ladies and gentlemen, feminists and comrades, thank you very much for your time. Our conversation is really scheduled for 2 hours from 2 to 4 o'clock. And I am going to really, given the time constraints, I'm really going to make 3 or 4 several points in relation to today's discussion. Is that I think we are celebrating, Africa Month right in the midst of, Africa Month and Africa Day in the midst of challenges within the continent, as a result of many complex challenges that dates back to colonial time, that range from governance issues, socio-economic issues, growing divergence between the poor and the rich, right? And also the call for more matured leadership to deal with cross-border migration issues, trade, and building a resilient economy. But I think before we start, I just want to really ask that we have a moment of silence just to pay tribute to, families who've lost their loved ones due to COVID. But at the same time, to really also acknowledge, and I don't know if anyone had paid attention to the police crime statistics that was released last year, where it indicates that, we've seen an increased gender-based violence, particularly in communities whom social solidarity and humanity principles are always embedded in the lifestyle in villages or in communities like Lusikisiki. I would really like us to take just 1 minute, to recognize that and actually begin to say that we denounce, the prevalence of gender-based violence and the fact that women live in fear and they're actually being raped by younger men within their own communities. Thank you very much. We may be seated for those who are standing. Just to say, I think 2 remarks is that, integration in Africa is a long-standing objective of African leaders and dates back from, OAU, because it seeks to ensure that it overcomes polarization of our economies, but also, it's entrenched in the Abuja Treaty Agenda 2023, which really looks at the structural transformation of African economies, industrialization, diversification, and local production. But at the heart of today's conversation is to really make it sure and say that with all the plethora of framework that has been developed to ensure that the African economies are integrated, but also profoundly is that they are not only industrialized, but there's a well-developed capacity of local production, is to look at what type of execution strategies that are existing. And I think Africa Free Trade Agreement presents an opportunity for that. And the African National Congress wants to be part of the conversation and ensure that it provides thought leadership around, rallying and ensuring that there's much more coordination, there's much more improved economic coordination and governance within the continent. I think with those opening remarks, I really don't want to take a lot of time because we've lost some time. I'm going to hand over to you, General Secretary Wamkele, to really share with us in terms of what is actually the genesis of the Africa Trade Agreement. And in fact, just perhaps to say two lines about who you are, is that Ms. Wamkele Mene is the Secretary General of African Free Trade Trade Agreement Secretariat based in Ghana. He previously served in as the head of mission to the World Trade Organization for South Africa, and later chaired the Committee on International Relations. He has a very long bio, so I think a few lines will probably be sufficient for us to just get to know him. Over to you, Mr. And I'm going to give you 15 minutes, gives you the anchor of the conversation, and then I'll get other speakers to participate after you. Over to you.
If I may say, Comrade Chairperson, for this opportunity to celebrate Africa Day by asking a very, very critical question, and that is, how do we advance the objectives of a continental market integration in Africa? You mentioned in your opening remarks the genesis of integration in Africa, starting from 1963, the Organization of African Unity. We all know that the main purpose, one of the objectives at that time of the Organization of African Unity, was to defeat colonialism, and that struggle was achieved with the defeat of the apartheid regime in 1994. Clearly, the Organization of African Unity, from a political sense, had many, many successes, which, as I say, ended the apartheid regime in South Africa. We have been able to achieve, to a large extent, as a continent, we have been able to achieve political integration. What we have not been able to achieve over the last 60 to 70 years is market integration, which is the next phase, as you pointed out, the next phase of the struggle on the continent is to integrate the market, to make sure that we have a single set of rules for trade, for investment on the African continent. So as much as we stand on the shoulders of the founding mothers and fathers of the Organization of African Unity, which brought about an end to apartheid and defeated colonialism, and that unfinished business is the integration of the continent. When we look at where Africa is today, we can, from an economic standpoint, we can make a number of broad general characterizations. Smallness of national economies, lack of economies of scale, fragmentation of markets, lack of industrial capacity, lack of productive capacity, and a continued over-reliance on export of primary commodities to countries of the North. And this over-reliance on the export of primary commodities is actually one of the main reasons why, as Africa, we remain trapped in this, what I call a colonial economic model, which we have to admit ourselves as Africans, we've sustained it over the last 60 years, this colonial economic model where we export primary commodities to the rest of the world. And so what the heads of states decided was that we need to address this challenge of lack of an integrated market in Africa as part of the arsenal of tools, as part of the tools that we have to fight poverty, to fight unemployment, and to create opportunities for young people. And so this trade agreement is not just a trade agreement in a classical sense. It is a tool for Africa's development. It is probably, in my view, the last chance that Africa has to make a very, very profound impact on job creation, on industrialization, on generally our economic development objectives. So we have a very unique opportunity as Africans. We have a very unique opportunity to use this agreement to do a number of things. First and foremost, in my mind, to industrialize the African continent. In the year 2019, Africa exported over $15 billion worth of pharmaceutical products. We, according to a study of KPMG from 2015, the coffee industry, we export raw coffee, $6 billion worth of raw coffee. But when you look at the global market of coffee, after processing of the coffee, it is up to $100 billion. If you look at technologies in the iPhone, we all know that the minerals that cost less than $5 in a single unit of a phone, the processing of those minerals is done elsewhere, outside of the African continent. And what really exposed the challenge that we have is COVID-19. When the rest of the world started imposing export restrictions on germ-killing products, on ventilators, Africa suffered. When the rest of the world was in a position to manufacture its own personal protection equipment, we as Africa suffered. Of course, after a few months, there were countries, Senegal, Kenya, South Africa, Egypt, that were able to repurpose their industrial policies so that they become more self-sufficient. But in general, what COVID-19 exposed is that Africa has got to be more self-sufficient from an industrial development point of view, of course, without disconnecting from global value chains and the global economy, but to develop our own capacity on the African continent. The second lesson that I think we should draw from COVID-19 is when you look at this issue of vaccines, Europe procured 4 times more vaccines than they require for their populations. And again, Africa is suffering. We rightly characterize this situation as vaccine apartheid and vaccine nationalism. But the real challenge, it comes back to industrial development on the African continent. We must see this as an opportunity to accelerate Africa's industrial development, to produce and manufacture our own pharmaceutical products. And this is why I say the AfCFTA is a very unique opportunity, because we now have an opportunity to establish an intellectual property rights framework, a protocol on intellectual property rights, which will be at the service of Africa's public health imperatives, as well as Africa's industrial development imperatives. So we have an opportunity to reconfigure, completely reconfigure through the AfCFTA, the intellectual property rights regime of the continent, to allow and enable flexibilities so that we produce and manufacture vaccines on the African continent in a massive scale, and not just in countries such as South Africa and Egypt, but that we have centers of manufacturing excellence and centers of industrial development excellence across the African continent. This is what, in my view, is the opportunity that is being presented by the African Continental Free Trade Area. Because for the first time since the end of colonialism and the defeat of apartheid, we now have in the African Union a single set of rules for trade, for investment, for competition, a single set of rules for the entire African continent. Let me talk a little bit about What is in this agreement? What is the scope of this agreement? Well, we have trade in goods, trade in services, competition, investment, protection and facilitation, e-commerce or digital trade, as well as we will have a protocol on women and young people in trade. So the scope of this agreement is very, very expansive. It is very wide, deliberately so that it captures the entire spectrum of Africa's economy, and to make sure that we liberalize intra-Africa trade, and that we not only reduce and eliminate tariff barriers, but also that we reduce and eliminate non-tariff measures, which we know are one of the reasons why intra-Africa trade is at a very, very low 18% as we stand today. So we have an instrument for the first time since the end of colonialism that will ensure that we leverage on this market of 1.2 billion people, a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion United States dollars, which is projected by the year 2035 to be close to 8 trillion United States dollars. This market that we have through the AfCFTA is potentially as competitive as India or China in 20 to 30 years' time. But of course, in order for us to be not just regionally competitive, but globally competitive as India and China, we have a lot of work to do as the African continent. And it starts with us accelerating industrial development on the African continent. In my view, we don't have a shortcut. We can leapfrog only to a certain extent, and that is in the area of digital technologies. But from a point of view of creating jobs, industrial development is actually what is going to enable Africa to push back the frontiers of poverty, to create opportunities for young people, and to place Africa on a path for value-added production in 20 to 30 years' time. We know, and I'm very much aware of the fact that industrialization is not a pill that you swallow and you wake up the next day you've industrialized. It takes decade after decade after decade of disciplined implementation of an industrial development action plan, very much similar to what South Africa has through the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition. We require urgently an action plan for Africa's industrial development that will enable us in 30 to 40 years' time to be as competitive as India, as competitive as China, and I believe it's possible. I believe it's possible. It does concern me as an African, the fact that Singapore, one country, an island, the contribution to global trade and output is over 6%. All of us combined, all 55 of us on the African continent, our contribution to global trade and output is less than 3%. And that is, it can be attributed to the first point that I made, and the fact that we continue 60 years down the line to export primary commodities. And we know the impact of over-reliance on the export of primary commodities. It contributes to this entrapment in a colonial economic model. And of course, it is not good to be reliant on commodities markets, which we know when they are subdued, global commodities markets are subdued, Africa suffers because of this over-reliance. So my objective is to make sure, Comrade Chairperson, that this agreement places Africa on a path, a sustained path for industrial development over the next 30 to 40 years. We know that it is going to take time, that it is going to be difficult, but we've got to start somewhere as a continent. 72 years ago, Europe started their market integration objective. And when you look at the difficulties and the challenges that European market integration experienced, yes, they are there. But for the most part, there have been benefits. countries such as Poland, who have tripled their GDP per capita since they have joined the European Union and the overall objective of market integration in Europe. Clearly, there are benefits. There will be benefits on the African continent too, but we have to understand that it is going to take time, that market integration, regional integration, intra-Africa trade, it is going to take time before we see the real benefits, and that there will be challenges along the way. The main challenge that we face as of today in terms of implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area are goods coming in from third countries. We know that there is a temptation to bring in a shirt from a third country, put a button on it and say made in the AfCFTA. We know that there is sugar that is being imported from other countries that comes into the African continent, displaces local markets, disrupts the value chain of sugar, as we know to be the case in Eswatini, South Africa, Namibia. Same thing in East Africa. And in West Africa, similar challenges in relation to the importation of rice from third countries. So there will be these challenges that we're going to confront, but the rules are there in the agreement. What is required of us is to implement the rules and implement the agreement as has been agreed to and adopted by the heads of states. And so there is, in my opinion, there is a real possibility that through the African Continental Free Trade Area, that Africa can actually make significant advancements in pushing back the frontiers of poverty, in industrial development, in creating opportunities for young people. When I was still at the DTI, the then Minister of Trade and Industry, Mandis Mpatwa, used to say that trade agreements are not about the past, they are about the future and where we want to go. And that is absolutely correct in this case. The World Bank has projected that in the year 2035, where we implement this agreement effectively as Africa, whatever effectively means, where we implement this agreement, we have an opportunity to lift 100 million Africans out of poverty by the year 2035, 70 million Africans out of moderate poverty, 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty, as well as making very, very significant advancements in closing the gender salary gap as a result of implementation of this agreement. And they further concluded that if we implement this agreement, we have an opportunity to contribute over $450 billion worth of trade to Africa's combined GDP. But these positive projections will not happen on their own. We as Africans will have to take concrete steps to make sure that we implement this agreement and that we actually see the benefits down the road that we do want to see. An immediate challenge is how do we make sure that the countries that today may not have the same level of industrial development as Morocco, as Egypt, as Kenya, as South Africa, how do these countries benefit? And if you look back to SADC, when we negotiated the SADC trade protocol, there were concerns from Malawi, from Lesotho. They were saying we will not be able to compete with South Africa. But today, Lesotho is part of the automobiles value chain of exports of vehicles that are being exported from South Africa to the US under AGOA, and from South Africa to the European Union under the Economic Partnership Agreement. Of course, it has taken time for Lesotho to be part of these value chains and other countries in the region. If you go to East Africa, there were similar concerns by Uganda and the other countries that we are going to be swamped by Kenya. But today, Uganda has a trade surplus vis-a-vis Kenya. And if you go to Kenya, you will find on the shelves, Ugandan milk, Ugandan agricultural products. But the way in which they were able to do that is through the development of regional value chains in implementation of the East African Community Agreement. And so, yes, there will be immediate beneficiaries. The big industrialized countries in Africa will be immediate beneficiaries, but in the long term, we've got to make sure that we bring into the fold countries that are not yet industrialized today as we speak. And it is possible to do that, learning from the experience of the East African community, of SADC, of the East Asian Trade Protocol. We've got to make sure that we bring them into the fold from an industrial development point of view and from the point of view of establishing these centers of manufacturing excellence across the African continent. And so, Chairperson, thank you very much for the opportunity for this discussion, which I think is very timely as we celebrate Africa Month, and as we ask ourselves as Africans very, very critical questions about how we move forward our continent in a way that will enable the continent going forward to withstand future pandemics from an industrial development point of view, from the point of view of public health. All of these things, in my opinion, are linked to Africa's capacity to industrialize and to be more self-sufficient from a productive point of view. So thank you very much again for inviting me, Comrade Chairperson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wamkele Mene, for the input. I think, one of the key issues around resilience, discipline, clear economic planning to ensure that Africa's economies are actually industrialized. So I'm not going to make really a summary of what you had said, but what I'm going to do is that in the next panelists, I'm going to ask them, to take between 5 to 8 minutes of the input. I'm going to ask them open-ended questions so that they're able to ensure that they contribute in the conversation. But also thinking in line, there are two things that what the ANC wants to achieve. The ANC wants to use this Africa Trade Agreement to develop a transformative framework and as well as a progressive approach in ensuring that all Africans benefit. So as you're making your input, I really want you to think through that and to take on multiple entry points in terms of your response. So our next speaker is Professor Thandeka, Nkiwane, advisor to the CEO of NEPA. She also has an extensive experience in field of international relations, writer, African thinker, reservoir in IR matters. Professor Nkiwane, I would really like you to really reflect on the state of readiness in terms of trade liberalization in Africa. And I think, Wamkele makes the point around they need to be resilient, but also that overnight. But I would really like to talk about what are the, conditions or predetermining conditions that we need to set up for the success of that. And I think, and that's why I was saying this conversation is truly about talking about execution. It centers execution and in a much more granular form. Over to you, Professor Nkiwane. I'm giving you 8 minutes. And then our next speaker will be Ambassador Kingsley, and then I'll address the thing that I would like him to talk about.
Thank you, Comrade Chair. I'm going to take less than 8 minutes. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can, but we can't see you.
I am trying to put my video on. It says that I can't.
Okay. Is it? Let's see. Shanaz, are you able to help us with that? And perhaps in the meantime, yes, you are on now. We can see you. You just disappeared again.
Okay, great.
Yes. Yes, maybe if you can lift up your computer a little bit or your chair or something. Yeah. So you can see half of your head. Oh, yes.
There we go.
Go ahead. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much, Comrade Chair, and very warm welcome to all colleagues and comrades to this webinar. It's very timely. As Comrade Wamkele mentioned, it's Africa Day tomorrow, actually. It's something that us in the AU family are going to be celebrating, organizing around. And I think your question about the state of readiness is critical because this past year and a bit, when we have faced the challenge of the pandemic, this has been, I think, one of the most critical interventions in terms of how ready are we as Africa to proceed along the lines of truly deepening integration. And, you know, when we look at how we advance growth and development on the continent, integration is key, but as Comrade Wamkele pointed out, industrialization is even more key and related. Those of us in the AU family, from my vantage point from NEPAD, it's something that we work closely with the African Continental Free Trade Area on deepening and developing. And some of the challenges, I think, Comrade Chair, that you alluded to, I think that perhaps I will address. The shock of the pandemic is clear. I don't need to go through the absolute shock to the system, to the global system that this created, but it created a level of economic destabilization, I think, that few had predicted. And on the African continent, it hit us hard. And it hit us hard because the fundamental networks of integration were disrupted. When we were cut off from global chains, global food chains, global vaccine chains, it's a clear challenge we're facing right now, airline chains, all types of global chains, which we have not deepened for a variety of reasons since the end of colonialism, the end of apartheid. It's something I think that brought into sharp focus the reality that unless we get our act together, unless we focus on deepening these chains, if they're broken, we're vulnerable. If they're broken, as they were, we are in trouble. And the reduction of the fiscal space, in addition to these vulnerabilities, created even more uncertainty. So that I think that this is one of the key challenges that we face currently and that we're going to face in future in terms of rethinking how we approach questions of integration very seriously, so many years after independence. I wanted to add in terms of challenges, one of the critical challenges, and it's actually something I'll revert back to. As NEPAD, one of our key challenges, our key roles is that of integration and is that of implementation around integration. And we do a lot of monitoring and evaluation, particularly around Agenda 2063. And one of the analysis and assessments that we did for member states, including South Africa, was that we're looking at how member states view their needs and findings around Agenda 2063. And one of the interesting things that came out of this assessment was, number one, the clear priority for countries even pre-COVID, that's 2019, was health. The vulnerability and the weakness of our healthcare systems. This was key. Only second to that, in terms of the assessment of member states, was economic integration, but it came a very clear high second. I think in terms of priorities, if I can see the stats, 74% focused on health, and from that, 52% focused on economic integration. Related to that, interestingly, 42% prioritized industrialization. So I think this question of strengthening health systems on the continent is critical. I won't even talk about the challenges we've been facing currently as we speak in terms of the vaccine rollout domestically. Second to this, in terms of challenges, we have to look at the diversification of our economies. This reliance on this primary colonial model of exporting primary commodities, importing industrialized goods, it's already been pointed out. It's a model that not only does not work for us, but it's a model that's becoming obsolete in this current world that we're facing. So this question of really seriously taking the question of diversifying our economies to promote resilience is going to be critical. In terms of challenges, I would also look at the question of strengthening internal markets and strengthening the financial and fiscal capacity of states. I think that this is going to be critical as well in terms of challenges. And I think that it all squarely fits in terms of remaining a focus not only of us as countries, but even of the ANC, Comrade Chair. As you know, in the context of a better world and a better Africa, integration is critical, integration is key in terms of a focus. This is one of the reasons NEPAD became a key program of the ANC, not just of the continent. Related to challenges, Comrade Chair, and I'm going to end just now, in terms of what I would look at in terms of approaching your question, I think one of the critical challenges faced by a number of African countries in terms of promoting even the African Continental Free Trade Area is the question of human and financial resources. So the capacity, even in negotiations, even if these realms open up for us, do we have the human capacity to engage in serious levels of negotiation at a global level? If we don't, how do we develop this capacity in order to be able to go head to head and toe to toe with countries in the current state and in the future, in terms of addressing current challenges and addressing future challenges? In terms of another challenge I would bring to the table and we can have in the discussion, I would say that it's a challenge member states in the AU face critically, the question that some member states and partners are negotiating bilateral trade agreements and bilateral investment agreements. And this, I think, is one of the threats we face in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Area and other mechanisms and other flagship projects of the AU. When we say we're going to hunt as a pack, and then others go this way and others go that way, so that we don't have the kind of solidarity we need to move forward globally as a continent. This is a square challenge that we're going to have to look at. I think the flexibility that we need to have in mind in terms of approaching questions of trade is critical. We have to be resilient and flexible in our thinking. We have to think outside the box in terms of approaching these issues. The mobilization of resources is going to be another challenge, I think, that we're going to have to face, Comrade Chair, in terms of your question, in terms of moving trade integration and liberalization forward. This is going to be critical in terms of mobilizing resources. And I think as well, we need to look at sensitizing not only states, but sensitizing populations in terms of a deep understanding of what's at stake, in terms of a deep understanding of the stakeholders, of the benefits, and of what trade brings to the table in terms of not just issues writ large, issues writ on the global stage, issues writ on the national stage, but what does it mean in terms of bread and butter? What does it mean in terms of job creation? And this is critical in terms of looking at particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. It's not just going to be huge global chains and global enterprises, huge multinationals that are going to benefit from free trade. It's going to be, and we're going to have to see how we can interpret it, scale it down, and make it comprehensible, make it understandable, make it a passion, give ordinary citizens ownership of this process, Comrade Chair. I think I'm going to stop there, and I'll hand over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Nkiwane. I think two things I've been requested to release SG, Mr. Wamkele Mene. He has an other urgent matter to attend to. Thank you so much, Mr. Mene, for your time and sharing the genesis with us of what the free trade agreement. You are excused. I would also like to acknowledge in our midst Deputy Minister Alvin Botes, who was meant to do opening remarks for us, and probably now that he's joining the conversation, we'll probably do the closing remarks. So I'm just going to request Deputy Minister just to follow through the discussions so that when we're about to close, you will then be doing the closing remarks in terms of our conversation. So our next speaker is the Ambassador Kingsley Mamabolo, who served as an acting joint specialist representative for Darfur and head of United Nations Africa Union mission in Darfur. Professor Thandeka Nkiwane raises the point around industrial capacity and bilateral trade agreement. I think you're in that space of economic diplomacy, and how do we manage this going forward? Can you please reflect, around what do you think in the light of already countries entering into several bilaterals with various countries, and how will this dovetail or actually undermines what the free trade agreement seeks to achieve? Over to you, Ambassador. I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and then our next speaker would be Ms. Lebogang Pheko.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to be in this forum, indeed, with all these distinguished scholars, Professor Amine, the Secretary General Wamkele, and Thandeka, and Mr. Pheko, who are in fact operatives on these issues and are pointing us in the direction that we should be going on these issues. But first, let me just... Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Chairperson, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, Ambassador, we can hear you. Proceed.
Yeah.
You may proceed.
I was saying before I make my comments in general, I think this is an opportunity. I would also want to thank the ANC for having zeroed on this topic, because indeed this is very important for us, reminds us of our obligation as a country and as a continent. Now, it is also an opportunity for us, I think, to ask critical questions. I don't want to pour water on what the Secretary General and everybody has said, and I'm very happy that they were able to show us the extent to which that this would benefit us as a continent. But for us to move forward, I think we would need to be asking critical questions, because, Chairperson, these questions have been asked time and time over and over again. If I recall the integration of the African Union, when the AU was formed, and people debated, our heads of states and government were debating as to why do we need a different organization. And it was felt that exactly what the Secretary General was saying, the need to pull in the strengths, economic integration and political integration. Of course, you cannot just talk of political integration, it must also be accompanied by economic integration. The heads of states are recognizing that, look, we have tried, and if you look at the Lagos Plan of Action, which clearly, if I was to quote from that, what the heads of states said at that time, they say, we are, they say we are, in assessing these problems, we are convinced that Africa's underdevelopment is not inevitable. Indeed, it is a paradox, they say, when one bears in mind the immense human and natural resources that Africa possesses. And they go on to show what we have as Africa: 97% of the world's chrome, 85% of the world's platinum, 64% of the world's magnesium, 25% of the world's uranium, and so on, 13% of the world copper, a third of the world's palm produce. Now, the question, I think the critical question we should be asking ourselves is if our heads of states from 1963, from 1980 with the Lagos Plan of Action, from 1991 with the Abuja Treaty, where in the Abuja Treaty they went on further to say, we need to be able to establish, say, the following protocol, and I just pick up a few. To establish a common external tariff, we need to be talking about a system of intra-community trading, trade promotion. We need to be able to talk about protocol on food and agriculture, protocol on industries, science and technology, protocol on transport and communication. These were the questions they were asking themselves at that point in time. We are asking the same questions today. I like the point that Professor Thandeka brought about the difficulty we have in countries going on the bilateral negotiations. Because indeed, to try and overcome that, Chair, Africa came up with the China-Africa Forum. And in that China-Africa Forum, we were trying to say we should be able to confront China as a collective, because it is it's not going to be a win-win situation if you are going to allow countries like Swaziland and Burundi, small as they are, to begin to negotiate with FADA and any other thing. They can only benefit in the long run if they are to negotiate as a collective. But as Professor Thandeka is saying, that kind of problem continues even today. The biggest question to ask is, what exactly? I think we know the benefits now, as shown by all this history that I have spoken about, and as demonstrated by what the Secretary General is saying. We know what the achievements are, but what are the challenges that create this problem? What we want to do is very clear. The AU talks about, and we need to, we have a timetable by 2063. We need to have a prosperous Africa based on Pan-Africanism. We need an integrated continent, politically united, but also economically integrated. But in addition, and I think this is another key factor that is a bit of a problem in Africa at the moment, an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and law. Now, all these elements are important in ensuring that in the long run, as the Agenda 63 says, we would want to see all these things happening. In the long run, we have the possibility to build this. I liked what I saw in your concept paper, Chair, which talks about the need for us to be monitoring the progress. What is it that will tell us that we have developed from level A to level 2? Remember, we have this obligation, all of us, to integrate the continent economically and politically. It's been a struggle for many years, from 1963. We've had divergent views on that if you look at the position of Kwame Nkrumah and maybe later on of Libya, Gaddafi's Libya, who wanted a different kind of union. And I think the winning position has been, we must move in a gradual transition to this kind of unity, because that kind of unity will be rich, will be deep, and it will afford us the opportunity to make genuine integration. Let's come to SADC. Clearly, there has been quite a lot that has been achieved. The trade protocol, but we still have problems. How then do we analyze and make sure that we organize around these problems? The one problem, which our Secretary General talked about, is this issue of goods coming from a third continent, which is a problem not only in the continent but in SADC as well. Do we have a feeling now, being in SADC ourselves, that we are making the right moves and in the right direction? I would like to finish, Chairperson, with an attempt that I thought South Africa was making much earlier on, particularly at the height of conflict at the in the DRC. There used to be jokes about the extent to which the entire cabinet of South Africa almost the entire cabinet would be there, trying one way or the other to match and help different sectors. You would have ministers of trade and industry, ministers of this and that, and we were negotiating, mediating the conflict that is taking place, but also trying to see what is it as the biggest country economically that we can do to prop up a country which has huge potential. The thinking there at that point in time was that if we could focus on centers like the DRC, if you look at in the West, you look at Nigeria, Sudan, and others that have potentially these huge possibilities. If these countries could be on their feet, these countries would in themselves, in the long run, be the chain pullers of the whole entire continent. I think that's what we were trying. If you remember, the slogan that used to go around was that we are prepared to punch above our weight. We haven't been able to do that for a number of reasons, and that should come back to the challenges that we have, that we are not alone in this terrain. We continue to have, much as we're making progress, which is slow progress, could be much more faster if we did not have the interference from outside of people who would, of course, be looking wherever they are, whether they are in France or Belgium or in any other place, and being worried about what kind of agreement is the continent making, what kind of agreement is South Africa and the DRC making, which would undermine the agreements that they have themselves with these countries. And clearly these are some of the challenges. And I would say, Chairperson, it would be important for us to be able to play a role focusing on the ANC here and other parties in the continent to look at all these other challenges critically and say, what is it? Reminded at all times that we have an obligation as a country to continue to forge this unity of an integrated Africa, politically and economically. Let me stop there. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you so much. I mean, I just want to build 2 points as I'm calling on Ms. Lebogang Pheko, who is a senior research fellow at and a political economist at a think tank called Trade Collective. She's an activist scholar, a public intellectual who has extensively contributed in framing, policy alternative that centers African women post-COVID economics. So, Ms. Pheko, I mean, part of what the ANC seeks to achieve is to engage diaspora around the Africa Trade Agreement, so that it's, African products also are able to have access to the diaspora community. But also at the same time, it's really looking at ensuring that it wants to frame a transformative framework. So as you really take on this issue, also think about how do we manage, nationalistic interests versus the free trade, and ensuring that nationalist interests actually, again, won't undermine what the free trade agreement seeks to achieve. And perhaps the last point, if you can also comment around the financing opportunities and the resource mobilization related to support with the national industrialization as a critical anchor for Africa's integration. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Nkomo. Thanks, Chair. So I'm going to try and address those issues in this presentation. And I want to start with a quote. First, I'd like to acknowledge all protocols and really appreciate this platform, which is really a conversation for all African compatriots and for all people who love our continent, and also very much fitting with Africa Day and whatever it may or may not mean. And I think that this is a dynamic opportunity to frame it in a practical, action-based policy framework, which we hope is taking us forward. But we have to acknowledge that there have been many reasons why the notion of African unity and free trade within the continent have not taken root in the ways that many people, our forefathers and foremothers, would have hoped. And I want to start with a quote by Walter Rodney, which perhaps might point us in a particular direction. And the quote says, "From the beginning, Europe assumed the power to make decisions within the international trading system. An excellent illustration of this is the fact that the so-called international law, which governs the conduct of nations on the high seas, was nothing else but European law. Africans did not participate in its making, and in many instances, African people were simply victims, for the law recognized them only as transportable merchandise. Above all, African decision-making power was exercised in selecting what Africa should export in accordance to European needs." So reframing and reimagining the African continent as an ascendant financial power, as a potential powerhouse, and so forth, it utilizes a very important instrument of new forms of captured imaginations. And this is the idea that Africa is an abyss and that Africa is coming, the African continent is a zero-sum total. And I think that as we have seen in the last 10 or 15 years, the idea of the African Free Trade Agreement and African regionalism has been dehistoricized. And I'm very appreciative of the previous speakers, including Ambassador Mamabolo, for contextualizing this and reminding us of Lagos Plan of Action and other important and brilliant initiatives which were hampered for various reasons, which were outside the remit of this conversation, but suffice it to say that they were not able to bring to life the aspirations of unity, despite the fact that, in fact, the African continent has been the preeminent continent which has had a commitment to regionalism and regional integration. Remember, of course, that the SACU is the oldest regional body in the world, 1910. So we are actually leaders in this regard. So I think that it's important that the idea of Africa Rising, the idea of African unity, and of course the idea of the Africa Free Trade Agreement is also located within the context of states which are dismantled, of deregulated international corporations, which often want to be privileged over and above states, withdrawal of subsidy subsidies from public utilities, Chair, and also the insistence oftentimes of liberal democratic models and regime change. So even though the Africa Free Trade Agreement is linked to free trade per se, remember that it cannot happen without other forms of resonance, without other forms of affinity. There are class relations which are also contested. There are also country political economies which individually want to locate themselves within the global context, which is exactly as Professor Nkiwane mentioned earlier, that very narrow economic nationalism is also part of one of the reasons which hampers us. We don't also deal with issues of asymmetry, the notion that not all nations are equal in terms of their intellectual capacity, their economic capacity, and their capacity to produce, to industrialize, and to be productive in various ways. The other point around this is that the AfCFTA has very much linked to GDP as a very narrow marker of growth and development. And of course, there's a lot of thinking globally, especially in the global south, and mentors like Professor Jomo Kwame, who have mentioned for many years that the GDP as a measure of growth, as a measure of social distribution, as a measure of economic distribution is far from efficient. And I've argued in many of my previous writings that using an instrument that was essentially used and utilized by fading post-colonial powers or fading colonial powers at the end of the Second European War, 1939-1945, is actually quite, is actually quite dangerous, because it actually then frees frames and does not contextualize the kind of growth, the kind of development, and the kind of advancement that is important in a 21st century African country context, appreciating, of course, that Africa is not a country. I'd like to also just say something quite briefly around, again, that the complexity of the AfCFTA also is in the context of the fact that there is changing global architecture. So we're dealing with the so-called rise of China and that of other emerging economies, the BRICS nations, which in many respects are going through their own states of flux. So India has been in a state of flux, and some of the figures as well don't bear scrutiny, but that's a conversation for another day. But the idea of, again, what growth is still very much hinged on these classical, very market orthodox measures of growth, not indigenous growth, not the growth, for example, of local industries, of local value chains, of women-centered economies, of parallel so-called informal economies, and so forth. So what are the key areas of immediate impact on these parallel industries or on smaller economies, to link with your question, Chairperson? Firstly, the promotion of customs cooperation to enable consistent, transparent cross-border regulation. And I think that I can't say much about that in this moment, but I think that we appreciate the complexity, the complication of cross-border regulations, especially because many countries belong to more than one REC, regional economic community, which means that the regulations are not even harmonized. Secondly, the reduction of restrictions that enable business people to move themselves and their goods much more easily. When I say business people, I am referring to what would traditionally be called cross-border traders, informal traders, and so on, which I think the languaging of that is also quite problematic, and it requires a shift in our conception. And if the AfCFTA is going to do things differently and have different results, much more democratization of economic outputs and outcomes, I think the languaging of policy should also be reflect of this. The promotion of value addition of goods rather than of raw materials. And we keep talking about this ad nauseum as African countries, as policymakers, as policy activists, and so forth, that the biggest problem of many African countries is the inability of infrastructure that enables us to export finished products. So therefore, exporting goods for free, raw goods for free, exporting raw chocolate beans and importing Lindt chocolates and Cadbury's chocolate. But the other piece of that is that our idea of value chain is overly externalized and overly internationalized. And I think internationalized should read as Europe and North America, and to some extent Japan, the so-called Quad nations. So this means that we are so focused on an economic market within the, outside the African continent, which is endogenous to us, that we have lost the opportunity to about 80%, 85% of a market share, which is on this continent. So when we're thinking about the value chain, the globe should include Namibia, the globe should include Kenya, the globe should include Nigeria. And certainly if this free trade agreement is anchored in pure pan-African ideals, as such as those which were promoted by your Kwame Nkrumahs, by your Nyereres, your Mwalimus, and so forth, surely this must be our chief priority. Notwithstanding, of course, that even within that, the levels of intra-regional trade, which is exactly the axis of this free trade agreement, are so low that even before we look at Japan and look to trying to export to the European Union and so forth, we really have much more scope to look at the untapped market of which is really ourselves. And next, the coordination of industrial and health standards, Chair and colleagues, which also means that it's very difficult for us to think about, how we export internationally, even within ourselves. So when we go to OR Tambo or any airport, remember that even when we go to Lesotho, that has now become international. So even when we are trading internationally, there needs to be harmonization of those industrial and health standards. And if those anchors are not strong enough at regional economic level, then they are not going to stand at Africa continental level. I think that the next part of that, of course, is simplifying rules of origin that recognize inland transportation costs as part of the value add in production, and also embedding intellectual property as part of the value add in production. One of the biggest things that's crucial to any economy or economies, aggregated economies that want to be competitive in the most democratic, radical sense of the word, is the idea of ideas, in fact. The notion that ideas can be protected, that there's a space for exploration, for innovation, and so forth. And I think that for a long time, it's almost inconceivable now that Japanese products were considered in the same way, and I want to use my words very carefully, but that were considered to be subpar in the same way some products from China are to some extent sometimes still considered to be subpar, but they are developing. I think for those of us who have migrated from Samsung to Huawei, we can see that they're developing. And how do they develop? By enabling that innovation, by opening up copyright so that different people can keep on improving on the model. So if we're thinking around an Africa Free Trade Agreement that enables value chain appreciation to happen in a way that closes the loop between production and consumption on this continent, those are things that should really be taken into account. Then we ask ourselves but then why? Is there actually a policy of solidarity that is underpinning the AfCFTA that will address these inequalities? And while the AfCFTA uses cooperation, the language of cooperation over that of competition, it's not clear what that will mean when countries actually enter what is still in effect a competitive process. And in fact, just in closing, I'd like to then add that some of the reasons why it hasn't worked so far, has been characterized as the following. The one would be nationalist rivalry. People want to be very nationalistic. Countries and states are very precious about, our sugar, our cows, our diamonds. And I think one of the challenges that we have is many African countries, especially SADC, is that, notwithstanding the Berlin moment and colonial balkanization, we are essentially one country, one region. So many of our products, our temperatures, our savanna and our landscape, our products are very similar. How do we deal with this? Secondly, we often have incompatible political and economic systems within and amongst ourselves. We also often have monocultural agro-based economies, we're dealing with unjust economic structures and over-dependency on the West, as I think one of the previous speakers mentioned. Oftentimes our aspirations does not meet our infrastructural, financial, and technical capacity. There's often a very uneven distribution of the benefits of integration. And there I want to levitate for a moment and note that out of all of the countries, the 54 African countries, we only have 6 which are not a member of more than one regional economic community. What does this mean? And I think at the moment you have Kenya, which is a member, which at last reading was a member of 4 countries like DRC, Tanzania, and so forth, which have had this kind of regional schizophrenia and belonging to different regions, sometimes quite irrationally in relation to their own geopolitics. What does this actually mean? It means that there's a lack of coherence in the ways in which they are doing trade. There's a lack of coherence in relation to the tariffs and taxes, and it's very difficult to build harmonization. And this is also one of the huge reasons why hitherto the AfCFTA has not been able to take place, has not been able to lift off with as much momentum, precisely because the REX, which was supposed to be a building block to broader regional economic regionalism, have become, in fact, in many respects, an encumbrance, a delay, and a stumbling block. And lastly, to speak about weak economic political governance, institutional capacity, and so forth. So in closing, Chair and good colleagues, and in response, I hope, to some extent to your provocations and your important insights, Ms. Nkomo, that market integration, if it's not sufficiently effective on the continent, then it means that we have to think of ways to then pole vault it into, and yet we want to pole vault into the global economy whilst the foundations on the continent are not sufficiently built. I'm not sure whether we are going to be able to build the results that we actually want. And I think that although the AfCFTA is one of the most is in many respects, in sentiment, extremely useful. In practice, it actually is a replication of some of the quite market orthodox, very conservative forms of economics that really speak to the post-Washington consensus. So I think that one of the challenges, I think, for scholars, for policy activists, and for people such as my esteemed colleagues on the panel, is to really indigenize and to rethink the ways in which this particular instrument begin to speak to African realities, African country realities in all of their complexity, in all of their asymmetry, and all of their complication. And I think I'll leave it right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pheko, for such, great insights, but also, I mean, the historical contextualization of where Africa economy is. I think, Siya, immediately, I think, the point that Ms. Pheko is actually, raising overall, she's actually saying that, I think she kind of like frames very well around the state of readiness. But then I would really like you to start, looking at, specific issues. She speaks about externalization of value chains, for example, and I think what are the opportunities? I would really like you to comment around the need for regional integration, for example, and in terms of how do we ensure that we institutionalize some of these value chains within the regions before you even take up to the continent. I think the issue of standards, you raise it, but also as a political economist, I would really also like you to talk about the issue she's raising around, whether the free trade agreement, it's underpinned by solidarity, and particularly given the fact that you're likely to have stronger economies benefiting, fairly fast comparing to others. I mean, our next speaker, Siya, is a political economist specializing in development finance, industrial development and regional integration, with extensive experience in research, organizational strategy, business development, and finance management. Siya, may I give you the platform to speak? I'll give you your other 8 to 10 minutes as well. And then we'll
Thank you very much, Comrade Chair. So I think I want to start off by saying that, agreements really are a sort of guiding framework. But I think what matters, as most of the speakers have alluded to, and particularly Ms. Pheko just recently, is that it's really got to look at what underpins the Continental Agreement in terms of the activities. I think in as much as a happy marriage isn't underpinned by prenuptial agreement or whatever kind of agreement you have, but rather the activities that you do as a married couple, it's also the same that applies to trade, in that it's not the agreement that really defines what kind of relationship we have, but rather how the relationship we have is being enhanced by the agreement that we are undertaking. SG opened up by saying that on the continent, we've achieved a lot in terms of the political integration. And I assume by this, he is referring to the actual agreements that took place in establishing institutions, in the plethora of institutions that we've also established as a continent, but which have not been matched by market integration in terms of the trade and activity that takes place. And I think here is a precise example of how we've put the horse before the cart in a way. If you look at other regions, for example, the European Union or the ASEAN region in Asia, ASEAN being the Association of Southeast Asian Nation States, is that they started off by trading. And it's really that once they've accomplished trade at around 40 to about 60% of total trade being committed internally, was when they established the institutions that now have been able to unify them in terms of policy and and political integration. And I think this is precisely the point, is that it's really the kinds of activities that we're currently undertaking that need to be enhanced by the agreement, rather than the agreement being the one that defines the activities that were taking place. So some of the reasons that the SG highlighted as some of the critical constraints to regional integration and furthering intra-Africa trade, he mentioned small economies, fragmented economies, lack of economies of scale, as well as the dependence on exporting of commodities. So what does this mean? That the bulk of African people generally are involved in either informal activities or activities that in many instances aren't necessarily related to what's holding up the macroeconomy of African countries, given the dependence on commodity exports. So the policies need to orientate themselves towards finding a place to provide economic space for the informal sector, which in Africa is still a very critical sector. Not only does this speak to social development, but this also speaks to other issues of social development, such as gender equity and the inclusion of women and children and youth in the economy, which are very, very critical in order to advance development. It's almost as if we need to separate the two issues of macroeconomic management from the issues of social development, because we're not going to be able to necessarily achieve the social development criteria and goals through these macro agreements and trade agreements, but we will, in many instances, inform the restructuring of African macroeconomies. But then we need to take these trade agreements further in terms of interpreting them into issues such as industrial policy and other national policies which are critical in order for each country to integrate themselves into the broader framework that defines the continental trade arrangement. I think I've said enough in that regard, that we need to
Sorry,
align the activities
excuse me,
with the agreement.
Sia. Sorry,
Yes.
Sia, excuse me. Can you come a little closer to your mic? I think you're not audible to other speakers.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
All right. And I want to move on to a second issue, which we haven't been touched on quite adequately so far, which is the issue of conflict on the continent. And I want to start off by just referring to some statistics of two major conflicts affecting the SADC region currently, in Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, as well as the eastern provinces of the DRC. So firstly, a total of 697,500 people, so close to 700,000 people, have been displaced due to the insecurity and violence in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. And this is only since 2017. And of the 36,000 internally displaced people from Palma, which is the central town in Cabo Delgado, 43% of these are children. So almost half of the people displaced internally in Mozambique are children. 32% are women and 25% are men. And this includes 454 unaccompanied children, 530 pregnant women, 1,200 elderly people, and an additional 166 people with disabilities. Similarly, the protracted internal conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo has newly displaced 1.7 million people in December 2019. And a total of more than 5.5 million people live in internal displacement due to the conflict in the DRC as at the end of 2019. These are staggering numbers if you consider the fact that, for example, the South African labor market is made up of about 9 million employed people, which means that the internally displaced in the DRC, for example, could have a productive capacity of almost half of the South African economy. And so a large part of these statistics I'm highlighting really show where the impact lies unfairly towards children, unfairly towards women, But the most important part is the fact that this is industrial, or these are people whose productive capacity is no longer part of the economy, and they aren't producing anything and are internally displaced, creating a social challenge in addition to some of the structural challenges that already challenge African countries in terms of development. So I think we need to more seriously take into account the fact of conflict, but more importantly, we need to deal with it from a dual point of view of understanding the humanitarian crisis caused by the internal displacement, as well as dealing with the conflict from a military point of view, which I think is unavoidable. But I think so far, what we can criticize SADC region and African countries generally for dealing, in terms of dealing with conflict, is that we've been too focused on a military approach whilst overlooking the very huge humanitarian crisis that is as a result of the conflict, if you look at some of the issues that I've highlighted. And I want to end off on a point of what has really been prohibiting further deepening integration on the SADC region. And deepening of regional integration on the African continent more generally. And I want to highlight 3 areas that I think are critical and suggest ways in which we can resolve some of these structural challenges that are prohibiting us from increasing intra-Africa trade. So the first constraint is around the colonial legacy and the geographic challenges. I think this can only be resolved by further infrastructure development in order to connect countries, but also ensuring that we also resolve the conflict, because without resolving the conflict, this also deals a further blow to the already significant infrastructure deficit that we face on the continent. I think without connecting countries with roads and rail and other means that actually are the backbone of trade, we're not going to achieve much with this agreement, which has a great potential, but needs further unpacking and further activities in order to ensure that our activities are aligned with the goals and objectives of the agreement. The second area is around weak states, corruption, and rent seeking. Here, I think a few suggestions in terms of resolving it could work. Firstly, being capacity building. We need to ensure, as mentioned by other speakers as well, that there is an existing state that has a capacity to not only monitor and police trade in terms of customs, but also cooperation amongst countries in terms of customs in order to ensure that we root out things such as round tripping or countries coming, imports from third countries, which also will be a core thing that are undermining further progress in terms of the actual agreement and regional integration on the continent. And this is also linked to the earlier point I made, that we need to deal with the conflict from a humanitarian approach as well as a military approach. And increasingly, we're seeing that the issue around lack of development is seemingly one of the core causes for the conflicts in Africa. So this is slightly different to historically the way we viewed it, in that we've viewed that the conflict is one that's undermining the development of Africa. Yes, that might be true in terms of the destruction of infrastructure, destruction of physical assets, and the like. However, there is interesting research that suggests that it's actually the lack of development as a result of states not delivering in terms of the developmental mandates, but also states not being able to police the entire geographic region that they have jurisdiction over, which is also creating a room for conflict to start as a way of rent seeking and a way of attaching themselves to patronage networks that already exist. And the example from Mozambique is a case in point, that the neglect that the central state of Mozambique has given towards the far-flung areas such as Cabo Delgado has actually incited a disgruntlement towards the state and created opportunity for insurgency to take advantage of the crisis in terms of the social development. I want to end off on the last point on industrial policy, trade, and undiversified economies, which is a critical area that I think is undermining or constraining regional integration on the continent. In that we need to develop the ideas and the goals that are in the Continental Free Trade Agreement into a plan of action. And this plan of action needs to be linked, obviously, with the potential of regional value chains in order to ensure that all countries have a mutual benefit in participating under this broader continental framework. The region will have challenges such as multiple memberships in regional economic communities is precisely because smaller countries are trying to take care of all their needs, which they cannot bargain for adequately in broader frameworks where they are bigger countries, which are more dominant. And so by ensuring that we take an approach that devises industrial policy linked to value chains, we ensure that smaller economies can also connect themselves into the broader value chain across the region. Similarly to some of the examples highlighted by the SG, such as Lesotho and its connection to the South African automotive sector. And I think with those few points, I do want to just say the real critical challenge is that we need to align the broader framework and the goals of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement with the current activities that were taking place. We need to deal with the issue of conflict, which is going to definitely undermine the progress that we can make in regional integration. And I've highlighted a few areas where we can improve in terms of reinforcing regional integration, which ultimately, in the current context of flux in the global economy and the competition that we face from outside, that we're not prepared to compete with in terms of lower cost of production in Southeast Asia, higher levels of industrialization elsewhere, can only be resolved by more equitable competition amongst one another. And I think I want to end on that point.
Thank you, Siya. I mean, the last point around equitable, competition, but also I think the point you're raising, the impact of conflict in the continents and how will it impact on this. And I suppose, with combined input, the ANC is actually sitting with so much, to process and really think about what are the entry points and how to, based on this conversation, develop a transformative framework. I think the panelists have really shared a lot of deeper insights and really also looking at, what type of macroeconomic framework that you need to design to be able to make it sure that the free trade agreement is actually effective, that, the current regime, and its pillars won't achieve much if there's no clear plan around structural transformation. We have several questions. We have some time, and I'll also allow Deputy Minister Alvin Botes, about 8 minutes to do the closing remarks and summarize some of the key output of the conversation. There's a request from outer Ghana to really reflect on the experience, on the on the thinking of the workers and the impact of free trade agreement. And I think workers are such an important constituency because in essence they are right at the heart of the the industrial development. They're in the belly of industrial development. There's such an important constituency here. So I'm not sure if a comrade, I think it's Comrade Zuda from Outer, are you there? May I request that Shanaz, you unmute him if he's here to just 2 minutes. I see there are two people with hands. Let me see. Okay, go ahead and then yeah. And then Donovan, I will give you a chance. Yes, Comrade Emmanuel Nduza, I'll give you 2 to 3 minutes to really reflect on the workers' perspective around free trade.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity and for organizing this important platform. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can. Proceed, sir.
Okay, as the labor movement, we really, support trade and market integration and free movement of persons, which are among the key pillars of Africa's regional integration. And all along, the African labor movement has supported the deep regional integration that will benefit all countries. The regional integration that should bring sustainable development and creating more decent jobs for the increasing labor force in African countries. However, our concern has been that the regional integration and trade agreements have mainly concentrated on capital and natural resource mobilization, and have tended to ignore the critical role of human resource mobilization and other social aspects. Therefore, we have a number of concerns, but in the interest of time, Madam Chair, allow me to just raise some few concerns about the African, the Continental Free Trade Area. First, how can we implement the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in line with the Protocol on Free Movement of Persons, Residents, and Establishment? How can together be implemented? Take into account that the two are key pillars of African regional integration, and the free movement of goods, services, and capital should go hand in hand with the free movement of persons. But it's very unfortunate now, if you look at the ratification on the Protocol on Free Movement of Persons, right of residence and establishment, it's only 4 countries that have ratified. So how are we going really to make sure that we really move in the speed which is required? Because there's no way you can talk about free trade without allowing the free movement of persons. Another issue is the discussions and implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and other AU initiatives should be all inclusive. We need to use inclusive approach in dealing with this. If we say all people should be involved. But I want to find out, maybe the Secretary of the AfCFTA can answer this, how other various groups are involved, e.g. youth, informal economy operators, women and workers, because we want everybody to be included in the process. And again, it was also raised by the Secretary about the benefits, because as workers, we sometimes face those kind of questions. How are we going to remove or ease fears that the benefits of the free trade could be unequally disputed and might lead to the hostile effects on labor force and small enterprises? How can we remove those kind of fears? But again, it was also raised by, I think, the Secretary and one of the panelists that how are we harmonizing various agreements we have already, ratified? For example, now in Africa, we have been negotiating with the EU on economic partnership agreements. So how are we going to reconcile the African Continental Free Trade Area with the economic partnership agreements? In the first place, we are supposed to have a united signed economic partnership agreement. But now we have bilateral kind of arrangement. Mm-hmm. But lastly, Chair, without taking much of your time, I think in Africa, we really need to address ourselves, especially when it comes to the implementation. We have a number of protocols, a number of agreements, but when it comes to implementation is a problem. Mm-hmm. Agreements and protocols are ineffective when they are not coherent and consistent. And it requires commitment, political commitment from all African countries. Mm-hmm. And also the agreements, trade agreements and protocol from the regional communities should speak to each other with the African agreements and protocol. Comrade Chair, in the interest of time, let me stop here. Maybe another, if I get another few minutes later, I can add more concern. But for the time being, let me end here. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Comrade Ruza and Zuta, for your insights. I mean, I think there are three critical issues you're raising. I think the one is around the need for human resource mobilization. It's actually quite important because no country, no continent will be able to industrialize if it does not invest in the skills and the capacity. Because the whole notion of industrial capacity is not only about machinery, but you need people who are going to be able to operate the machinery. But at the same time, from a product development perspective, but also you're raising, either important issue, whether the fact that only, less than 10 countries that have ratified free trade agreement could be indication of lack of political commitment from the leaders. And I think that's a point partly that Donovan is asking, Comrade Donovan is asking in the Q&A. I think the other one is really managing the fears and how do you ensure that you manage potential hostility towards workers. And like, as I was saying that, in the same way that workers are such an important constituency, women as well are such an important constituency, so that they fully understand how they benefit, as well as young people. And Siya exactly makes the point. The harmonization of protocols is such an important issue, so that you make it sure that there is really nothing that contradicts each other, but also we drive towards, the same objective. So the whole notion of crafting, a unified agenda. And I think the ANC, as the governing party in South Africa, but also with a, kind of like a little bit advanced industrial capacity, it needs to be able to provide leadership in the continent and ensure that it provides, sufficient support around the industrial capacity. Now, there's a question. Donovan, your hand is up. I'm going to give you a floor, and then I will read the questions and just allow the panelists to take up each question. And I would plead with you in the meantime just to read the question so that you can take a question that you feel comfortable with. And then after that, we'll go to Deputy Minister Alvin Botes for his closing remarks. Donovan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I hope yes, I think you are hearing me. Let me firstly say, well done to the African National Congress, Comrade Chair, that in particular we have noted, and we hope all other webinars will follow suit, that there's a strong presence of women on matters, and it's not just discussing so-called women's issues, but it's discussing the real issues and the issues of the day. And we hope the rest of the webinars follow suit and ensure that we have a strong women's presence in all our webinars. This is quite important for us as comrades. Then let me go quickly to the question. For me, and it's a pity Comrade Wamkele, or the General Secretary, has left and was not able to stay for the whole webinar. But why are we having the free trade agreement? And one of the panelists, Ms. Pheko, raised about why you're measuring GDP. Because if is your measure for the free trade agreement GDP, then it means you're more worried about economic growth. And we are not doing the free trade agreement. The question I would ask is that, are we doing the free trade agreement for economic growth? Because that is in our mind what will have sustainable development, or we're doing the free trade agreement for the purpose of ensuring that we have jobs, for the purpose that we have a better life for all Africans. And currently, what we have seen is most of our development is directed at selected elites. That our development is elitist. It does not take into account the numbers of people in poverty and poor, because our models of development, our models of businesses in either mining, in agriculture, and even retail is based on paying as little wages as possible. And this is across the continent, even countries which larger economies than others like Egypt or South Africa or Nigeria. Their industries are based on elites within our society exploiting the poor. So if the AfCFTA is going to be ensuring that we have free trade, that free trade must be people-based. It must be based on changing the models of how our businesses run. Because from a mine worker to a farm worker to a teller, in a cashier in retail, all of them are paid not living wages. And this is the problem with Africa's development. So when you want to increase trade, how are you going to increase trade if the poor are no more poor? It's as simple as that. And this is what worries us when we look at things like the free trade agreement, that it's a free trade agreement to increase trade, but it's trade that the elites will only benefit from. And by the way, maybe some stage later, the poor will. This is different to what Singapore did. This is different to what China has done, because China has placed the people as the main object of their economic development, and we have not done that as Africans. Thank you, Chair. I hope
Yes.
I was quickly.
Yes, no, excellent. I mean, I think the crux of your input is that, in fact, if a free trade agreement is really based on orthodox economics, I mean, we must really think twice about its success. So it's something that we really need to integrate. And I think part of what the ANC, as part of its thought leadership, and ensuring that there's a transformative framework that emerges from a free trade agreement, is particularly looking at the economic organization and the governance, both from a national perspective and regional perspective. Mohom Magabe, you have the floor. Mohob, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. You have the floor, and I have other two speakers who have raised their hand, and I'll give them a Siya Biniza, you'll be the next. Mohobo, you have the floor. Mohobo or Mohobo? Oh, okay, let me unmute you, sorry. How do I unmute you? Sorry. Shanaz, can you please help out? Just want to unmute.
Well, you have to click to unmute.
I did that. Okay, it looks like Siya, what's happening?
I can hear you, Chair. Thanks.
I think go ahead. I'm sorry, Comrade Mohobo, you'll be the next. I'll unmute you while Siya Biniza is speaking. Go ahead, Comrade Siya Biniza.
No, thank you very much, Chair. And we share the very same sentiments with the latter speaker, that we congratulate the ANC for having hosted such an important webinar, which shares important information. And we also congratulate the speakers, the panelists, for having shared valuable information to all of us. I do totally agree with quite a number of assertions that were made by a number of speakers. I want to also specifically pick on the issue of resolving conflicts. That I do agree that resolving conflicts is also critical to ensure that the smooth free trade is also implemented. But it must be extended also. I agree that we are discussing SADC here, but the discussion, since it speaks about Africa Free Trade Agreement, free trade area, we must also extend the discussion to speak about the challenges in the Renaissance dam between Egypt, Sudan, as well as Ethiopia, as well as the discussion about the challenges about Western Sahara, that they might add on more challenges in terms of the free trade agreement. So resolving challenges must not also be looked at our regional level. It must be extended to discuss issues of Congo, to discuss issues of between Ethiopia and Sudan, about the disputed area there, as well as the Renaissance dam. But also, I do want to also challenge the panelists to share their ideas about the discussion on Fourth Industrial Revolution free trade area. That I agree with the labor representative that ensuring that human capital is also free, has also free movement.
Siya Biniza, we seem to have lost you. I don't know what's going on with Comrade Mohobo. Can you try, Shanaz, to unmute him? Because I've been trying to do that. And it doesn't allow him to talk, unlike other speakers. Oh, yes, go ahead. Yes, go ahead, Comrade Mohobo, you have the floor. I'm sorry, I think we've lost Comrade Siya, but go ahead.
He must unmute himself as well.
Oh yeah, I think yes. I think okay. He's unmuted on my side. Comrade Mokhobo. Okay, all right. He doesn't seem to have a. Okay, in the meantime, can I ask for the panelists to really comment on the two questions? I mean, I don't think really they were questions, but I think they were comments from both Comrade Donovan and Comrade Siya. Any panelist can pick up the comments. Yes, Comrade Mokhobo, you have the floor. We've allowed you to talk, but we can't hear you. Okay, Ms. Pheko, perhaps since you would like to be excused, may I request you perhaps to just make some comments on the two comments that were made from the floor by the speakers?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much, Chair. So thank you also for the very vibrant interaction from the colleagues. Looking at the Q&A, I think in the interest of time, unfortunately, it's not easy to go through all of them as pertinent as they are, and perhaps we can engage with them via email subsequently so that they're not lost. But I do want to say something around the low wage model firstly. And I think that I agree to a huge extent that the modern industrial complex really trades itself off on low or no wage labor. And it's really a complex which has its origins in the pre-industrial revolution. It also has its origins in the mid-Atlantic trafficking of African people to various worlds. And that's a model that has been used to foment all kinds of, to give the assertion that industrialization is easy, or that it can only be done when there are fair labor wages and so forth. And if we understand how empire works and how colonial imperial economic empires have built themselves, they've built themselves on the exact antithesis of what they now promulgate on behalf of the rest of the world, which is good governance, labor relations, democratized workspaces, democratized political relations, and so forth. And I think that we should be very cautious in our own growth trajectory to be mindful that we are in fact inheritors and participants to a great extent of a similar labor model and of a similar economic structure, particularly because we are overly invested in international economics and international markets, especially as South Africa as a large economy. And I think that what we need to also rethink is the definitions of work, the definitions of income, and the definitions of livelihood, because these things are not necessarily the same. So the notion of working for free and the notion of the working poor, whilst you have an industry that is growing and not growing jobs, but rather growing disparity and growing inequality, needs to be examined very carefully. And I go back to my, some of my penultimate remarks that for the Africa Free Trade Agreement to be effective, it needs to be mindful of its own languaging, the way that it needs to preface so-called informally waged work, rather the parallel economy. Otherwise, it's going to reproduce the same kind of joblessness, the same kind of social and economic exclusion that the classical economies that we are living in have produced. And secondly, there was a point that somebody was making around I think it was social movements, and I'm sorry I'm moving a bit randomly, but I'm trying not to miss anything. And I think that in relation to social movements, I think that the relationship between social movements and structures such as the BRICS, structures such as the Free Trade Agreement is essential. And I think in South Africa in particular, we have an important history of social movement mobilization. So the Anti-Privatization Forum, for example, the Landless People's Movement, and so on. So I mean, there are all of these movements were exactly movement of organic ground up to build in accountability. The danger of these sorts of movements is that once they are attached to any institution, to any structure, like any movement, there is the potential and the danger of them equally becoming co-opted and becoming quite reactionary. And almost, I think what we saw at the end of the last 10, 15 years was almost the NGOization or the taming of what used to be very radical, important movements, which were speaking in a voice that was very much the voice of the dispossessed, the marginalized. And I don't like to say the voiceless because everybody has a voice, but I think that the dispossessed and the marginalized. And I think that the only spaces that I'm seeing that now are probably in radical Black feminist spaces, and to some extent amongst some of the movements of the homeless, Abahlali being one of the most notable examples. But I would like to say that there will always be dangers in attaching CSOs, whatever those may or may not be, and social movement to institutions, because by their nature, institutions tend to be quite conservative and can have the opposite effect, which is quite a taming, diluting effect. I think I'll leave it there, Ms. Nkomo.
Thank you so much, Ms. Becker, particularly with the last point you're making, because one of the key things that the ANC's objective commits itself into is engagement with the civil society organization or those movements that are not part of governing structures. So in essence, framing that really helps, because they need to mean that they need to reach out because they are such an important constituency, but also not to hold government accountable, but also to ensure that the actual multiplier effects from a developmental perspective really gets to benefit the poor and the marginalized. Thank you so much for that. Siya, do you have any comments? Ambassador, and then just to say, Deputy Minister, just get ready in the next 5 minutes. You will then be doing the overall closing remarks for us.
Chair, it says I can't open the video.
Yeah.
But okay, I can maybe let me just talk.
Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think to me the discussion reflects the difference we have between what is ideal, what we want to have, and of course the problems we may encounter in implementation. A good start to have an ideal situation which we are working for. Maybe let me start with the issue raised by Donovan about elitist. I would say, Chairperson, that we, in terms of our documentation and what we want to achieve, it's very clear. And I don't think the programs that we are talking to are elitist. If there is a government that perhaps deviates and practices that in a different manner, that's another matter. If you look at Agenda 2063, quite specifically says clearly that what you need is high standard. We want to achieve a high standard of living, quality and well-being of citizens. Mm-hmm. We want educated citizens, skills revolutions, underpinned by science and technology and innovation. Healthy and well-nourished citizens, transformed economies, modern agriculture, and so forth and so forth. That really, to me, and of course that also comes to that issue that Comrade Nzunza was raising. It can't be just talking to elitists, it is actually focusing on the people. Now, whether in the implementation, that's what we achieve in the long run, may be a different thing to look at. Now, we have our own monitoring programs that we have put in place. One of those is the peer review mechanism. Mm-hmm. And I think what we need to be asking is, how effective has it been? It's a peer review mechanism. You're supposed to have experts coming into your country and looking at all aspects of your development, and then say, look, we should be able to put you in a meeting where we say, look, comrade, or president, so and so, you are not doing 1, 2, 3. And if you are not doing 1, 2, 3, this is a recipe for conflict in your country in the near future. And that's what has happened. The peer review mechanism must be able to say loudly, the other members, heads of state, should be in a position, and we know this is difficult in the AU. It has always been difficult because of the national sovereignty issue. Our heads of states will be very careful how far they go in criticizing. But we have a mechanism that is supposed to be working efficiently and effectively to make sure that we correct the wrong things, some of those which are cited by Donovan and the others. Mm-hmm. Corporate Chair, there's this question very quickly raised by President Zunza, I think, of the economic partnership agreement. You know, the tendency to go bilateral when we want to go collectively. I would say to that that is indeed a serious problem. How do we do that? Because once we create these forums that we spoke about, one of those being China, Africa, and many others, to try and encourage collective, there will still be a tendency by member states to want to have a bilateral contact with whoever. And if you try and persuade them otherwise, they will be telling you, look, you want us to follow you and so on, and you would have a serious problem in convincing them otherwise. The question of free movement, and I agree with the points made so far, that trade agreement can only go with the free movement of goods and persons. Maybe important to point out that at least one area in Africa seems to have been able to achieve this, the West African country. I'm told they have a passport there, one passport, ECOWAS passport, and so on, which talks to free movement of persons and not just only goods. I think we're having that problem here in Southern Africa. And I am sure if you ask, there might be valid reasons why we have not been able to achieve that in the region here. But it is an important component, as the comrades are demonstrating. But there might be valid reasons, part of which I think is the issue of this unequal economic growth of countries in the region, which creates a huge problem. However, we need to look at that issue and say, ultimately, we need to be able to address that issue. Conclusion, Chair, this issue about Sudan and Ethiopia and the Sudan, Egypt, the conflict there, this is a serious problem. I must say, just demonstrating that we'll continue to be beset by conflict for a very long time. I'm surprised that we just talked about conflict. I think somebody did introduce the fact that part of the conflicts now we're having is this insurgence, the rise of Muslim insurgency in particular, which you see in West Africa, which is now visiting us here in Southern Africa. That is something that adds to the conflict. It's not just an ordinary conflict. It is something that we have to deal with very seriously. The dam between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, that's a serious problem. I think the important thing is Africa needs to be central to this. We can't have a situation where the outside are taking initiative. We must make sure that countries in Africa, we are able to resolve our own problems at our own pace. Thank you very much.
Yes, absolutely. I think, I mean, at the heart of the conversation is to make it sure, I think, the point that Ms. Pheko was raising around, the solidarity principles that underpins the free trade agreement. Because if we use the competitive processes of, for the free trade agreement, in fact, naturally we're going to actually be entrenching social and economic exclusion. So I think that's the inherent risk within the system, and it means that we really need to think much more deep about how is that transformative framework that is linked to the free trade agreement is actually designed. Siya, you have the floor, and then I'm going to call on Deputy Minister after you.
Thank you, Comrade. I just wanted to make a comment on some of the issues. So the first one is around the issue of freedom of movement. I think firstly, we must admit that we're in a kind of neo-colonialism. By that, I mean that a lot of Africa's development is still dependent on foreign financing. And if you look at the financing of our regional economic communities, usually it's by external donor partners, etc. And hence the issue of freedom of movement of people is not going to make it on the agenda, because simply those countries have got actually more access on the continent in terms of being able to travel freely without visa or visa on arrival than even some African countries have. For example, 2021, the German passport is the strongest passport, and it has got access to almost every African country, I think, aside from Angola. Whereas if you compare, for example, the African passport and the rest of the continent, we have major restrictions in a number of countries. And one would expect that at least amongst ourselves, we would treat external countries at least as equal as we would treat one of our own. And so freedom of movement of people is not an issue for the funders of African development. I think that's the first point. The second point is around the issue of how these elitist sectors become the defining sectors of the economy. And I think this is again related to the dependence on commodities, but also our dependency on foreign direct investments or foreign capital. In that when the capital comes, it's automatically going to be attracted to the highest return sectors in order to hedge for political risk. And so foreign capital is not going to experiment with youth enterprises, women-led enterprises, etc. So what's the solution? I think we need to develop our domestic capital, rely more on domestic financing of our own development in order to overcome some of these problems, because it's only domestic capital that's going to experiment and lead us to achieve some of the socio-economic development goals that we have, apart from the broader macroeconomic goals which drive multinational companies and the pursuit of profit. On that note, thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think spot on. I think domestic capital has a higher appetite for risk, particularly with the partnership with fiscal support, because in essence, for us to be able to develop industrial capacity, you need a bottom-up driven approach so that you lessen the dependency from the West, but also you are able to internalize the value chain systems within the domestic economy and promote regional integration. With that, colleagues, I mean, we're almost, 4 minutes, you're 11 minutes over, and thank you so much for your time. I'm going to give now the Deputy Minister, Alvin Botes, to take us through in terms of his own reflection and what he thinks then becomes a package of activities. I think what is becoming clear here is that there needs to be a follow-up conversation going forward to really delineate and also tease out what are the specific areas that we need to. I think today was really a launching platform to say, yeah, let's start this conversation because it's important. It's about us as the ANC members, also it's about us as African citizens and within the Africa Month. Over to you, Deputy Minister, you have your 8 minutes.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Comrade Phelisa. I'll, of course, try to take less than 8 minutes because we have exceeded our time. But, you know, comrades, let me first give an acclamation for this type of engagement, because I think we are obligated as the African National Congress to reimagine post-COVID-19 economic dispensation. And when we reimagine that type of dispensation, comrades, we cannot do it outside of the purview of how your non-state actors actually sees the conduct of both the state and in particular capital in relation to recalibrating our economy. And that's why I was quite amazed, and I think it's a point of interest. I think it was Comrade Siya that actually correctly characterized the relationship between the African National Congress and monopoly capital. And that relationship, Comrade Phelisa, has been characterized as a relationship of unity and struggle. And I think there is a point made that I would recommend that we probably further dissect around the role of monopoly capital in reimagining post-COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it's one of my first proposals because in the chat groups there has been an emphasis, Ugote, that we need to continue with this type of debate. The second and a key pivotal matter that has been amplified is what I would characterize as the political economy of African conflicts. Because I think a number of comrades quite correctly have raised quite pertinent issues that, for example, the challenges in the northern Mozambique and Cabo Delgado, it's not necessarily a challenge of insurgency, but what underpins that violent extremist comrades that we are seeing there is the role of your liquid fuel gas. What is the type of role that liquid fuel gas in northern Mozambique are playing? We of course, if you look deeper, at a detail level, we'll have to have some conversations about the debt composition of the Mozambican state. I think it's quite an important issue that we need to further make a diagnostic reflection on. And I think Comrade Ambassador Kingsley have indicated that you know, in the DRC, you have the biggest UN peacekeeping force in excess of 10,000 rand, your MONUC mission, that has not been able to secure peace for a period of almost more than a decade. And you know, your minerals, the role of a key mineral, in particular cobalt, that are used in new technological devices such as your iPhone, your 5G, etc. I think it's important that we look at it as a key issue. Equally so, if you look at the Gulf issue, the challenges between Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, I think it's a national resource that seeks actually to advance, you know, in particular the north of Africa. But there is a contest because of the economic posture of particular countries as it relates to that matter is concerned. And I think it's important that we need to look at those issues, including your maritime opportunities and threats that the coast of Somalia, of Somalia in particular, represents. So I think it is quite an important issue, and I'm raising it, comrades, because during our chairmanship of the African Union, the thematic instruction note was to silence the guns as necessary condition, as a precondition for Africa's development. So you can't reimagine, you can't recalibrate African economy even through the instrument of AfCFTA if there is not a cessation of hostilities. So I want to make that express recommendation, Chair. Secondly, look, comrades, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement has been ratified not by 10 countries. It has been 24 countries has actually deposited its instrument in May, I think, of 2019 already. So it has been ratified by 24 countries. And I think the ANC is elated that your biggest economies have actually subscribed to this, including Nigeria, which of course had at a very late stage actually engaged in the ratification process. But I think it's key and critical. And I'm raising it, comrades, because this political instrument that we are engaging on through the AfCFTA, it's supposed to benefit not only your large economies in Africa, but also your smaller ones. But what is important is for your biggest economies, for example, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, to anchor this type of an instrument and to lead in the process of tariff reduction. I think that is a key issue. More importantly, Chair, and I'm raising it because I don't think there is a debate that says the free trade agreement is not a necessary condition for our own emancipation, as we envisage the African 2063 that speaks about inclusive prosperity. And I'm raising it because if you look at our statistics, just because of the free trade agreement in Europe, 67% of intra-trade has been able to be possible. If you look at the Asia as a group, 61% free trade as intra-free trade has been possible. And I think it is an instruction note, and I think it's an obligation that we must be able to harvest this free trade agreement. And I'm raising it here because our economic growth that we are striving towards, you know, in terms of meeting the objectives of the national democratic of the national development plan speaks about 6%. We cannot achieve 6% if we have not been able to ensure that in unionism, your regional economic community, your SAC that we are part of, are moving forward in a very seamless type of manner. So I thought that that is a key issue, but an important matter has been raised. And I think Donovan have raised it and spoke about what is the class orientation of this free trade agreement. I think the first issue, comrades, that we have to say is we have to say that the African National Congress, we see ourselves as a chief representative of our people. It therefore means that any new policy instrument that government actually imagine should have a class content and have a particular consciousness. And I'm raising it, comrades, because what our Black business community must engage with, and everyone else, is that there is no disclaimer with your free trade agreement that necessarily there should be a subscription to, for example, empower those people that historically has been dispossessed or that has been economically alienated because of either colonialism or apartheid in our instance, etc. And that's why one of my footnote that I want to present to this webinar, Comrade Phelisa, is that your BMF, your NAFCOX, all these other non-state actors within the economy should try to draw up some inscription note as it relates how to advance broadly the African Black industrialists as when we implement the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So I thought that must be, my immediate impression, comrades. And like I've said, from the African National Congress, we will continue to engage social partners as we seek to deepen our understanding of what needs to be done for the African continent. So having said that, thank you very much, Comrade Phelisa.
Thank you so much, Comrade Alvin Botes, for that. And I really like your framing of class issues, because at the heart of economic inclusion is ensure that you address class issues. Gender issues are also naturally embedded into that. So it's really going to be important. So I think part of this conversation is that the ANC is not only taking a burden of leadership and thought leadership, but also is to profoundly look at what type of both political convening power it enjoys in South Africa and the continent, and how it uses that to make it sure that there's a unit of purpose, there's a coherence in terms of thinking, but also there's making sure that you pick up low-hanging fruit while at the same time you're addressing other systematic issues. And thank you so much for that. There was a comrade who was insisting, Comrade Zico, I know he comes from the trade unions, so I'm just going to break protocol for a second. I know that there were closing remarks. If I can give him a second, if he's still here. But yes, if he has left, I'm going to give a Comrade Putsisa to talk about the program, 2 minutes, and then we adjourn our session. Putsisa?
Ayiko.
Okay, Putsisa, if you're
okay. Am I on?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I was trying and I was covering. Okay, thanks very much, people. I know it's pretty late. Mine is more about the process as one of the people who was in the oven baking this event. It's obvious from the inputs that there's one, not been enough time to address this as usual, and two, now that OATU has initiated what we also keen to see or to hear as to how we can take taking step forwards in what we, in the sense that this was an ANC initiative, the probabilities is that we can actually jointly engage and set up future webinars with your OWATUs and any other non-state actors. I think the closing point, Phelisa, is to say the main aim of this webinar was to ensure that the non-state actors, the non-government component in Africa, that's engaging on the free trade initiative, because the very Comrade Wamkele Mene, he interacts with heads of states, with foreign ministers, with trade and industry ministers, but hardly with the non-state actor component. So thanks very much for participation. Ensure your contacts are in the chat, or if not, go back to the people who gave you the, or sent you the invitations. We obviously will go back to the drawing board and work out a follow-up program. Thank you very much. Asante Sane, Siabulela, Kanimambo, and all of that. Okay. Amanda.
Thank you so
Amanda.
much. Yes, Amanda. Thank you so much, comrades, you know, ambassadors, diplomatic community, feminists who are here, you know, comrades who are coming from non-state orders, who really taken the time to be part of us, you know, for the last 130 minutes. We truly appreciate your time. I think you demonstrating as well that you're taking interest. I think as Phelisa said, is that the team that has put together today's webinar with Phelisa, Susman Domeso, and thank you to Molly Dlamini, who really helped me with the protocol issues this afternoon. Thank you. They'll go back and then look at the planning and get in touch with all the comrades regarding the next program. Asante, thank you so much, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Bless.
Thank you. Nkosi.